Okay, commissioners, thank you, and thanks to Eversource for allowing me to rejoin the meeting. I'm seeking a motion to approve the recommendation for final license, specifically item number 7 on the agenda, Greenfield Greenery LLC, license number MC 283117, subject to the conditions recommended by staff as included in your board book. Is there a motion? Are there any questions?
Commissioner, can I ask, are there members of our licensing enforcement team that are joining this portion of the meeting?
I know we have Ms. Defoe here. I believe Mr. Potvin is also available to answer any questions you might have. Okay. And we also have members of our legal team if there are any additional questions.
I think it might benefit us all to have some additional context here about this application and sort of the process with this application, and also a change of ownership conversation that's happening. So maybe Kyle, if you might just kind of give us an overview of what this is.
Sure. Mr. Potvin.
Thank you, Commissioner Stebbins, and good afternoon, commissioners. Greenfield Greenery LLC, as outlined here on the commission's public meeting agenda, staff is recommending it for final licensure based on established processes, namely the fact that they were originally issued a provisional license. They were inspected by our investigators within our investigations and enforcement department, and their facility and their operations and standard operating procedures were deemed to be fully compliant as outlined on the executive summary that was including in the commission meeting materials for your consideration. Therefore, at this point, staff are recommending it for final licensure. I'm also happy to entertain any specific questions that you might have.
Commissioner Concepcion, do you have any further questions?
I'm bringing up my notes here.
Sure.
I had a couple just about the timeline. Mr. Potvin, so this is our third time with this license on the agenda, correct?
I believe so. If you include its renewal, it would be the third time the commission, this would be the third vote on this license at some stage in the process.
Do you mind going through what those previous votes were for?
Yeah, absolutely. So based on the commission's licensing system, Mass CIP, the licensee here, Greenfield Greenery, was originally approved for a provisional license by this commission on February 11, 2021. That was the first vote. The second vote, just incidentally, was for its first renewal, which was approximately 1 year later in February of 2022 at that public meeting. And now this is the third vote for consideration for final licensure.
That's helpful. And for each of those instances, so February 11th, 2021, February 10th, 2022, and then today, do you mind giving us a list of those in direct and indirect ownership for this entity, for clarity's sake, both for us and for anyone who's participating?
Yeah, I think for the sake of accuracy, based on also going off of our official licensing system, which is the official record keeping system for our licensees, I can tell you that when the license was voted on and was before the commission for provisional licensure on February 11th of 2021, the individuals that were listed as persons with direct or indirect control, having direct or indirect control, were Randy Facey, Angie Facey, and Shannon O'Brien. That was the initial vote for provisional licensure, and those were the individuals listed on the license application for your consideration at that time. So that is one point in time. As of today, the license record that is maintained by Mass CIP shows that the individuals listed as persons with direct and indirect control are Randy Facey and Angie Facey.
Thank you. And then are you able to provide the information for that February 10th, 2022 in terms of direct and indirect ownership?
On who was on the license record at that time?
Yes.
For your consideration for renewal. Give me 1 second. Let me take a look in our licensing system and I can get that information for you.
Thank you.
So Commissioner Concepcion, the answer to your question, at the time that the commission voted on the renewal application as submitted, originally submitted in December of 2021, December 31st, 2021, and for the vote that happened on February 10th of 2022, the individuals that were listed on the license record on the renewal application and therefore was updated upon the approval of the renewal. The individuals that were listed as persons with direct and indirect control were Randy Facey and Angie Facey.
Okay. And so these are the three, including today, the 3 times that we've seen this license, but we have not had it on our agenda for a change of ownership, correct?
That is correct.
And according to our regs, I see our enforcement counsel here as well. Maybe I'll ask you this instead of giving my own interpretation. Do you mind walking us through section 104 of the regulations in terms of change of ownership and what that process is and what happens if that process does not take place?
Are you asking Counselor Enforcement Counsel or
I am.
Mr. Potvin?
I'm asking enforcement counsel Rebecca Lopez.
Okay. Counsel Lopez, you can join us when you're ready.
Sure, let me just pull up the regulation if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So in general, the process of change of ownership is an application process, as you know, that when an owner is going to be added onto the license at a certain threshold in terms of their equity interest, then the entity, the licensed entity, would submit a change of ownership application, which would be processed and considered by the enforcement department. Not in all instances is the application submission required. It does depend on the action that is being taken by the licensed entity in terms of the ownership change and the equity interest involved. And the assessment of whether or not a change of ownership is required through application is an assessment that is made on a fact-dependent basis.
And then can you tell me what happens if an entity does not ascribe to that regulation in terms of notification and going through the change of ownership process?
So if the enforcement department identifies that there has been a violation of the notice requirement or the requirement to submit or seek approval of an ownership change, then the customary process in that instance would be to issue a notice of deficiency relative to the violation and to receive or offer the licensee the opportunity to submit a plan of correction in response. And then other potential consequences could be that the violation itself is an inquiry is opened in terms of the change of ownership itself, But that's usually not in relation to a notification issue. That can be an inquiry that is done separately regarding the merits of the change of ownership application itself. And that is part of the review of the application. But in terms of notification, that is usually handled through our standard compliance dialogue relative to notices of deficiency and plans of correction.
And is this license undergoing that evaluation currently? I don't know if you're able to provide that, but if you're able to provide that information.
I would prefer not to speak to that.
Okay,
In a
that's
public
fine.
setting. Thank you.
That's fine. One more question and I'll hand it off. I know I'm asking a lot. I just wanted to get some, this is our opportunity together to ask these questions. The last thing is that in our meeting materials, it states that there's no new information that's been discovered by the Cannabis Control Commission regarding the suitability of the license since the issuance of that February 2021 provisional license. And maybe now I'll ask Kyle, because I know this is a part of that licensing, either one of you, sort of how does that, because there were some changes that happened here, is that a consistent statement with the facts that we have before us?
It is a consistent statement based on the available and known information that we have at this time as we are currently performing a due diligence review. So that statement is accurate.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Concepcion. Commissioner Camargo, did you have your hand raised?
Commissioner Roy can go. She has her hand raised.
Go ahead, Commissioner Roy.
Okay. My question is to Council Lopez. I just want to be clear before we move to vote on this license that according, like Mr. Potvin said, according to Mass CIP, Shannon O'Brien is not listed as having direct or indirect control on this license.
So as Director Potvin just stated, we can, say that in our licensing records, Shannon O'Brien is not listed on the licensing record for this licensee at this time.
And Commissioner Roy, I would, as it's the licensing record, and while Enforcement Counsel Lopez's input is always welcome and appreciated, just as confirmation again, as the Director of Licensing for the Commission, I can also confirm that that statement is accurate.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Potvin, so I just want to reiterate also that according to your best of your ability in licensing, that this license is in full compliance before us today, suitable for vote and review and vote.
Based on the Commission's longstanding practice of, I guess, for a lack of better term, shepherding licensees through our application of licensing process.
Yep.
Based on that established process, the staff do still recommend this license for final licensure.
Okay, thank you. And I just have one last question. I'm sorry, then I'll hand it off to Commissioner Camargo. There is a precedent where the Commission has voted when their change of ownership has not been voted on before the Commission, but we voted on other aspects of the license, whether in renewal or provisional or final. Is that accurate?
It's accurate to the fact with the exception of provisional.
Okay.
Because changes of ownership only
That's
affect
true.
licensees.
So final
Yeah.
and renewal.
Yes, that there have been numerous instances of that. The
Okay.
exact number I don't have, but yes, they're two
Okay.
separate processes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Camargo.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a few questions, and thank you for all the questions that have been asked already. So, General Counsel, I think you're on as well. But I guess a few questions, and you guys can break these down however you want to break them down. One is, how is this all possible without a change of ownership in front of us? That's one. Two is like, I don't know, General Counsel or Compliance Counsel, Enforcement Counsel, Rebecca Lopez, what can you all provide us some clarity on the process of sort of like this situation in terms of us voting on this today? So I know there's there's different options. So I think it'll be good for us to hear those options. I think also for the public to hear those options, but I think I have some other questions too, but those two questions I would like answered before I go to the other questions.
So I can just, so Commissioner, thank you for your question. I would just say that what's before the commission is this final license application. So the commission is evaluating whether the licensee is compliance with the statutory requirements under Section 5 B2 and the regulatory requirements under Section 500.103 sub 2. So that's the limits of the commission's consideration. Under the regulations, we do consider the application process for licensure to be distinct from an application process for a change of ownership and control. So under the regulations, the commission has viewed those as two separate processes. We also, under our regulations, for example, Section 500.002, consider application materials and investigatory materials to be confidential. So while staff is conducting its review of the pending application for a change of ownership and control, they are maintaining the confidentiality of the records. And that's, for various reasons in order to basically ensure the integrity of the commission's process. So if you don't have any further questions to me in that regard, I will turn it over to Rebecca Lopez.
General Counsel, I think you may be able to answer the other question as well, in terms of what are our options here as well.
Sure.
I want to hear that as well.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for clarifying that. So the commission has an option to approve the license with conditions, deny the license, remand with directions to the executive director and staff to take additional actions. The commission can also move to postpone consideration of the license. There is theoretically an option for the commission to not take any action at all. That has a certain degree of complexity to it, but it is among your options.
Mm-hmm. Councilor Lopez, how did we so thank you for that, General Counsel. How did we determine that, and for this instance, I'm going to say Shannon O'Brien. Shannon O'Brien does not have ownership in this license if we ourselves have not seen a change of ownership or the background on the change of ownership. So how are we determining that without that being in front of us today?
That's an excellent question, Commissioner Camargo. So again, what the Investigations and Enforcement Department is bringing before you today is a complete application in regards to compliance with commission regulations based on our established process and based on the records and documents that we have at this time. So we can convey to you the facts as they are demonstrated by the record. We cannot make any other representation in terms of an opinion relative to the current license status, because that is not what is presently before you. That's where the change of ownership application, which is still pending, comes into play.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do have another question, but Commissioner Stebbins, do you have any questions?
No, finish your questions. Did
Okay.
you want to direct I think he wanted to direct a question to Director Potvin, or no?
Yeah, well, I do have, I guess I don't know who this question's for. I'm glad that all the lawyers are here today. But how does this, and I have to ask, how does this all comply with our enhanced code of ethics as pertaining to ownership on a license for any commissioner, while still not having the change of ownership in front of us?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. So as to the extent that the chair had any concerns about any ethics issues, she's recused herself. So the commission is basically moving forward with the remaining commissioners. It can vote on the application has a quorum, it has enough to take official action. There's not any ethics issues that run directly to the commission as a body. The ethics issues run to the commission, individual commissioners, so and staff, and individual and commissioners and staff have been, all been so advised. So I would say to you that from my perspective, you should be considering the license application in terms of its compliance with the requirements for licensure set forth in our statute and regs. You know, the ethics issues are kind of separate from that consideration.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess my question is also, so I have a twofold question on this one, Christine, and I don't know if I guess if I was unclear a little bit, is I get what you're saying, and I know why our chair is recusing herself today. Obviously, that's the ethics issue, but I guess my question is our enhanced code of ethics, right? So
Yeah,
as it pertains to,
I see.
yeah. So as
Okay.
and let me just tie it to this, as it pertains as well to what record do we have, right? We have to vote on this.
Yeah.
So what record, as one of our options, what record do we have that we can speak to today that Shannon O'Brien is, according to sort of what y'all saying, that she's not listed as a direct. So what record do we have of that right now?
Okay.
And also
so,
tying that to the enhanced code of ethics.
So Commissioner, I think, so I would highlight to you, so the commission under by law established an enhanced code of ethics. And that enhanced code of ethics, specifically section 6 sub F, provides no commissioner or employee may hold a license or registration issued by the commission. So the essential legal question there is whether a commissioner holds a license issued by the commission. So this phrase has not been interpreted either by the commission or the State Ethics Commission or any kind of reviewing court. So it's the interpretation of that provision and its application here is an unsettled issue. Okay. So in other words, the commission could discuss and deliberate that to the extent that it considered that to be relevant to this, what's before it. So, you know, I would leave it at that, and I would recommend, if I may, to the acting chair that we could take a minute to recuse, to recess, if commissioners wanted some further advice with regards to that particular provision.
Let Commissioner Camargo finish up. Commissioner Roy. Commissioner Camargo.
Yeah, so thank you, General Counsel. I appreciate that. So let me just bring us back to July 17th, 2019. So this was obviously in the beginning, but there was a somewhat of a similar situation, maybe not as similar, but there was a situation with a license that was sent back for remediation or remand. So I guess for me, and I think I've asked enough questions, I get it. I'm very unclear, and I don't feel like I have all the information yet to vote on this license. And I would send this back to our team and to our staff so that we can look at things together, parallel, and really understand where we're at and have some clarity on this to make sure that all parties are okay. At the end of the day, we have a licensee somewhere who is sort of in limbo today. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Commissioner, before I invite Commissioner Roy to ask a question, the example or the case you used with respect to the July 7th, 2019 license that was remanded, do you have any more details on that motion or why it was remanded, or even perhaps staff might be able to point that out?
Actually, Mr. Potvin is all part of this here. It was a license with Cureleaf. Back when staff recommended approve of change of control subject to conditions, so it's all here. But if anybody wants to go back and look at it, you know, it's sort of a similar situation. I guess for me, it's just very unclear. There's a lot of unanswered questions. Christine, our general counsel, you spoke a little bit to it right now. So for me, I think that we need to either take a recess or look at this, but I know Commissioner Roy also has some questions, so I'm just gonna turn back the floor.
Commissioner Roy?
Thank you, Commissioner Stebbins. And I guess I have a statement observation, and it's going to echo Commissioner Camargo. I think obviously at the end of the day, we're all striving for full transparency, all of us. And if we remand this, at the end, also we have to be mindful that we have an outdoor cultivator. We only have 16 in Massachusetts. This would make, so we don't have many, and they are considered a complete application. But we want to be fully transparent as well. So if we remand this back to the commission, when can we reasonably expect to have information around change of ownership so we are able, as Commissioner Camargo said, to have both of these things parallel to vote on, mindful that we have a complete application before us? Thank you. Whoever wants to take that.
Commissioner Roy, if there's nobody else, I will definitely provide you an answer on that the best I can anyways. So the change of ownership, as was alluded to, is with staff, it's undergoing a due diligence review. Essentially a due diligence review is objective fact gathering, where staff are in the process of that, like we do with every change of ownership. I don't think staff are in a position to give an estimated time frame, because that process has to play out in a very neutral and objective way. So we will do the fact gathering and see where it leads us. But to be able to give you kind of a date would probably do some harm to the integrity of the processes that we've established.
Commissioner Roy, do you have anything else?
No, I think that satisfies my question. Obviously this wouldn't drag on for, ever and ever, because, that's, the commission has to do its process and we don't want to taint that. So I want to be very mindful and respectful of that. And that's all. There's a complete license before us. We just want to make sure we get this right at the end of the day as commissioners, and be fully transparent. So thank you all for indulging my questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Concepcion, you had your hand up.
I did. I just had hopefully a straightforward question. For transparency's sake and for the sake of our work here and clarification for the public as well, are we able to state for the record that our current chair, Shannon O'Brien, is not an owner and does not have a financial interest in this entity? Are we able to provide that?
So speaking to that question, because the change of ownership is still in the fact gathering stage, the due diligence review stage, I'm not in a position to answer that question. The only thing I can do is based on the license record in our licensing system. She is not listed as a person with direct and indirect control as of today. That is the best answer I can provide to that question.
Okay. Commissioner Concepcion, anything else?
No.
Okay. Commissioner Camargo, you raised the question or mentioned the interest of perhaps having or I think the GC did, my apologies. The GC, happy to make herself available if anybody had any questions that she could answer for an individual commissioner that we would probably do offline and take a brief recess. Is that of any interest to any of my colleagues? Commissioner Roy?
I just have one final question for, I guess, Councilor Lopez. If we as a body vote to remand this, can we state why we are remanding it? We are seeking further information around change of ownership.
I think I'll let Enforcement Council answer, but I think we would need to do that. We'd have to have specific instructions, just as we would need to have any specific details around any vote ever on any license to deny a license. But Councilor Lopez, you can tell me whether I was right or wrong.
Absolutely. So my understanding is that there would have to be, an articulation of that, but I do defer to General Counsel on this because she is the appropriate counselor with respect to that issue.
Thank you, Enforcement Counsel Lopez. So yes, the recommendation would be, Acting Chair, that you work with the Executive Director to bring a motion that would specify the grounds for the remand. And if the commission would like to identify specific steps that staff would take, that should also be incorporated into that motion. My understanding is that I've worked with the Executive Director on some proposed language for a motion. If it's helpful, we could work with, we could share that with you.
Did I see somebody else have their hand up, or maybe I didn't?
I think I waved a little bit. I'm just curious, Commissioner Stebbins. I wanted to hear if you had any, questions or thoughts about, this process and the license itself.
Yeah, thank you. I'll compliment my 4 colleagues. You raised a lot of the questions and answered, I think, asked what I think are the most pertinent questions to this discussion on this license today. Again, I'm mindful of the fact that we're really reviewing what is in front of us right now, which is, according to Licensing and Enforcement Council, is a license application, a final license application that has met all of our regulatory requirements. So that's kind of where I feel at this point. And again, and it's certainly, again, appreciate the questions that my colleagues have had, because I think they're certainly pertinent to the conversation. I would suggest, again, let me ask again, is there any commissioner that feels they would like to have a conversation with our GC in which we could take a brief recess? If that is something that anybody would deem appropriate or would require, we can do that. Commissioner Roy?
If it's okay with my colleagues, I'd like to see that motion language.
That's what I was going to ask.
Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
I agree, Commissioner. I agree.
Yep.
Okay. I've been shared a draft motion which would move to remand the application for final license for Greenfield Greenery MC 283117 to the Commission's investigation and enforcement staff for further evaluation and consideration relative to ownership and control as defined in 935 CMR 500.002 in order to ensure compliance with Mass General Law Chapter 94G 5B2 and 935 CMR 500.103(2) and 500.104B. I know if I asked you all to spit that back at me, you would have no problem doing that.
Commissioner Stebbins, do you want to ask us, or do you want us to sort of react?
I mean, that's a draft motion. I would invite your reaction first
I would like to
before
make
we
it. Let's
before
make
we
the
entertain a motion.
I think it's clear that this needs some more work. I mean, from this conversation, we need more information. And maybe I'll speak for myself. I'm not in a position right now, based off of this conversation, to move this application along without first remanding it and getting some more information. If everyone is okay with that, I would like to make that motion.
Okay. Can I ask you if and again, I apologize that I'm reading this, that the directions that come with any vote to remand the application, are we covering all the bases of interest to the commission? Is there anything that outside of the language that I've shared with you would be of interest to commissioners, or is the interest as it is prepared now is okay with everyone?
I think that's okay. I think what I was thinking, like remanding it to investigations and enforcement staff for an evaluation of ownership and control. And like that, I feel like what you said covers that as well. I'm sorry, Commissioner Roy, you were saying to repeat that. Commissioner Stebbins, you might repeat
if you don't mind, could you repeat that, the language again on that condition?
Sure.
Thank you.
This is a a move to remand the application for final license for Greenfield Greenery, MC 283117, and this is probably the most pertinent language, is to the Commission's investigation and enforcement staff for further evaluation and consideration relative to ownership and control as defined, and then obviously there are the statutory and regulatory acknowledgements.
May I?
Commissioner Camargo?
Yeah, thank you. General Counsel, does that language assume that they come back together?
Yeah, it's a good question, Commissioner. I think that if there is still, say, licensing staff is prepared to come back at the next public meeting, and there is still a application for change of ownership and control under review, I would support staff in asserting the confidentiality of that investigation until they can complete their process. So I don't, so I think it encompasses that, but that the staff would still have the option of saying we're still in process on that. Essentially doing what they're doing at this meeting today.
Commissioner Roy?
So I have a question. If this rolls into February, we would vote on a renewal?
So I guess I'll take that from the licensing perspective, Commissioner. That really does depend on the licensee for submitting a renewal application
Yep.
in a timely manner.
Okay.
And my understanding, I don't have the exact expiration date at this time, but following the fact that it originally was issued February 11th of 2021, renewed on February 10th of 2022, I think it's fair to assume that the license is due to expire probably around the same time, February 2023. But again, that does depend on the submission of a renewal application by the licensee.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions or thoughts? Commissioner Concepcion?
I'm thinking it through. I see our Chief of Investigations and Enforcement on my screen, so I'm wondering if he had anything to add as well, just because this is his department. So if it's okay, I would like to see if he had anything that he wanted to add to this conversation.
Sure. Chief Chibi?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I don't really have anything to add other than this. I know that Commissioner Roy was and the commissioners, you guys were asking, would, in terms of after any due diligence review, with the application as well, the application for licensure, which is before you today, as well as any kind of consideration in terms of change of ownership review will come before the commission at the same time. I believe it was kind of answered, but I just want to make sure that there's different tracks with the change of ownership that could occur. So there'll be no way in the world that we could predict that. So I just want to make sure that the commissioners, I want to make sure we're transparent about that. Like we're only speaking about what we understand right now in terms of the record. We're not making any opinion. We're not stating what any speculative facts. That's unfair in terms of process for everyone involved. So I hope I get the sense that the commission appreciates that. So I just want to make sure that we have that understanding in terms of whether or not these two pieces will come before you at the same time.
I had another question.
Concepcion? Sure.
Thank you. I had another question because Chief, you hit on something I don't think is necessarily clear to the public. And we know and we understand that these two processes, final licensure, provisional license, that is a separate process than the change of ownership. I was wondering if this might be a good opportunity to explain that process and the fact that they are two sort of separately moving vehicles that happen and occur throughout, our processes here at the Cannabis Control Commission.
I think that, as Director Potvin had stated, is that, in terms of process, and Director Potvin always changes, he lives with this every day, but the change of ownership application would be filed, if you would, through our Mass CIP system and our licensing team would process it. They do conduct a due diligence review. Pursuant to that review, different things can happen. I don't want to speculate before the commission what those things are. And I think it'd be unfair to parties involved as we're speaking about the specific issues. But the fact that there could be a due diligence review where different things can happen, it makes it unpredictable in terms of what would come before the commission. Meanwhile, what you have had before you today is what which Director Poffit is trying to say, is that there's certain things that licensing must be in compliance with in terms for licensure, and they have met all those requirements, and that's completely different. And I think that Director Poffin can reiterate that again. He certainly could say it better than me, but I just want to make sure that we don't conflate. And I'm sorry.
Does that usually occur at the same time? If someone is applying both for a final license and for a change of ownership, is that a common occurrence?
I'll let Director Poffin answer that particular question.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Commissioner Concepcion. So our change of ownership process, as outlined in 500-104 of the Commission's regulations, envision that a licensee, once provisionally licensed, at any time of them being licensed and actively licensed, can apply and seek approval from the commission to change and add individuals and entities with certain amounts of ownership or certain control elements to their positions or to their business organization. It has happened where a licensee, just speaking generally, changes of ownership have happened for a licensee that's in a provisional license state that hasn't reached final licensure. It's happened where, in a case like this, where a change of ownership might be happening along a separate but along the same temporal track as them being considered for final licensure. And it can happen once they commence operations and after their final licensure. Its changes of ownerships have been submitted by licensees at various different stages of licensure.
But so the change of ownership is a proactive application that happens separate from a final and provisional license. So if someone were to change ownership, they cannot do so by changing a provisional. They have to go through a change of ownership process here.
That's correct. Once the commission approves the licensee for a provisional licensure, that is where our process has been interpreted that the change of ownership requirements under 500-104 are triggered, where if they are adding individuals or entities in certain with certain qualifications or certain ownership stake, they have to submit an application for a change of ownership and seek approval.
And did that happen here?
So we currently have a change of ownership application that is currently under review, under a due diligence review.
Okay, thank you.
Just to, if I might, just to pick up on that, Director Potvin. So we had a number of changes of ownership before us today, obviously all filed by folks at various stages of licensing, not necessarily tied to their approval today for a provisional license or a final license or any of our renewals, correct? They're not, what I'm saying is they're not tied together, I think is the point you were trying to make.
Yeah, and just to think about that for a second, Commissioner, and I think what Chief GB tried to reiterate, and I think I've tried to state this as well, is that our licensees are required to submit that change of ownership once they are provisionally licensed. It has never been tied to the next stage of licensure or having to be done at a certain stage of licensure. Just after they have to seek that approval once they are licensed. And those two things, if they're moving through the licensure process from provisional to final to commence operations, that is a completely distinct and separate process than a change of ownership.
Commissioner Camargo?
Yeah, Kyle, if you can, when was this change of ownership? When did it go into play? What we're talking about?
So I can confirm the date that we received the change of ownership application through our licensing at cccmass.com email. That was on May 22nd, 2022.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And-
Director Potvin. Oh, go ahead, Commissioner Camargo.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just thought. So Kyle, so that was submitted May 22nd of this year. By who?
By a representative, to the best of my knowledge, by a representative of the licensee.
The licensee. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for all these
Yeah.
questions and all your expertise on this stuff. Thank you.
Thanks to our entire team. I greatly appreciate it. We had been considering draft motion language. I guess one thing that concerns me is that the remand is there's no trigger point. I guess there's no time associated with it. If we are remanding it for further evaluation and consideration, I'd want to be clear that staff could bring this back to us without disturbing the due diligence that they need to go through with the separate application for change in ownership. So I'm mindful that I'm trying to understand what that triggering language to everybody's thoughts, like what would prompt somebody to bring it back? If we are tying it to a separate application and due diligence review, then I think there needs to be some acknowledgement of that. But at the same time, I'm not trying to necessarily speed up one. I want to give our licensing and investigation staff the opportunity to go through the due diligence thoughtfully that they need to do on the change of ownership application. General Counsel, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Well, one of the things that I would encourage the Commission to understand is that I think to the extent that it's being remanded to staff, that it return to the Commission at some future point through our regular process, which is in consultation with the Executive Director. Okay, so just one, making it clear we should move it into as best we can our regular process, our established process. The second thing that I would, I did speak to this, but, the motion includes basically the change of ownership and control process, but I wanted to be very clear that I think staff would still have the ability to assert if it was coming back on other matters, that if their review of the change of ownership and control application was still in process, that is considered to be confidential under our regs, and they would not be reporting on the substance of that review. They could, for example, report on, the process of that review, that, that process has, moved to a certain stage, that kind of thing, but they should have some protection as to the substance of that particular process. So I don't think the motion language as drafted prevents that from happening, but you could always add some language to the motion to make that abundantly clear.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Commissioner Concepcion, I think I saw your hand first.
So I had a question about maybe I'm trying to think of who to direct this to, but any of the lawyers who are on the screen now, talking now, why avoid having them coupled together, both the final licensure and the change of ownership? What's the impact of that?
Can I take a first shot at that, and then I would defer to either Enforcement Counsel or Director of Licensing?